Hello, everyone. My name is Ruth Lowenkron. I am slightly above middle-aged and have, I guess it doesn't go with that. I have brown hair, but it looks like brown hair, and glasses and a black turtleneck and a black and white sweater. I use she, her pronouns. I am the director of the Disability Justice Program at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. And my office is also a member of Correct Crisis Intervention Today, New York City, which I mentioned because we are very active in this space. I will just briefly let you know who else you have in front of you, and you'll hear a longer introduction later. I'll do it, I believe, in the order of appearances. First, my esteemed colleague at Disability Rights New York, Mark Fliedner, who is the director of both the work dealing with persons with mental illness and those with traumatic brain injury. We have our panel moderator, Alex Vitale, who is a professor at Brooklyn College, as well as the coordinator there of the Policing and Social Justice Project. And he will moderate the panel, the following three panelists. We have Steve Smith, who is a physician at Columbia Department of Psychiatry. We have Jeanie, who is the medical director, the senior medical director at Fountain House. And we have Felix Guzman, who works with Vocal New York and is also my buddy at CCIT-NYC, Correct Crisis Intervention Today, New York City. So you'll be hearing more about them in a few moments and more from them. I get to just tell you a little bit about the program and about our work at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. First of all, just to remind you, make sure everyone's here for the right reason. This is called Burying the Myth. Mental illness does not equal violence. This is the second time that Disability Rights New York and New York Lawyers for the Public Interest have cooperated in a webinar effort. And we determined that this was really what was needed in the space of mental health advocacy, that far too much of what we are seeing that we do not like as advocates is happening because there is a false conflation of mental illness and violence. And I predict that this myth will really be dispelled for you this evening in very short order. So a little bit about us at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. We started out about 50 years ago. And one of the things that we do is interface with the private firms and provide them pro bono cases. And for any of you who are there with not-for-profit offices, you too can utilize that matchmaking service, if you will, to get pro bono help. When we started out with that goal in mind, we also said we should have an in-house practice. Where is the need, they said, and it was determined that it was in the disability justice space. And so we've been doing that for almost 50 years since our inception. We also have an environmental justice and a health justice program. About the work that lands us directly in the space of mental health crises, we started that when I began 6 years ago, literally on day 2 of the job. One of the horrible instances of an individual experiencing a mental health crisis being shot and killed at the hands of New York Police Department happened that day. That was Deborah Danner, a middle-aged African-American woman in the Bronx. And that certainly got me started on the quest for who's doing what in this space. That's how I found CCIT-NYC. And this has become a huge priority in our office, what we call advocating for the transformation of mental health crisis response in New York. Again, not directly the topic today, but I do believe, as I said before, that that topic is what underlies why we are having problems with our mental health crisis response. I think it could not be clearer, and no doubt the panelists today will say that one of the best ways to deal with mental health crises is to provide voluntary treatment. That will cut down on the number of crises right there. And if someone still has a crisis, there's even more, or at least as good a need for that voluntary treatment, so that even when a crisis is appropriately de-escalated, there is a treatment to be provided to the individual so that you are really serving the individual. We also very strongly believe at CCIT, at NYLPI, that what is needed are very obvious services in place like housing, employment, and that you are not doing justice to the mental health community if you are ignoring that. Just a few areas that we've touched on in our advocacy space, and then I'm going to hand it off. Just so you know, we are, first of all, available should anyone have concerns about mental health crises response. Please do contact us, and I believe that information was in your registration materials, but very quickly, you can contact me at first initial last name, rlowenkron@nylpi.org. And we are advocating in this, and we are, by the way, especially looking for individuals who may have been harmed by the mayor's new policy announced on November 29th. So if you know of anyone who has been involved, and you'll hear much more about this policy, of individuals being swept off the streets because they are believed to be unable to take care of their basic human needs and brought to psychiatric hospitals, you will please send those people to my attention, because we are concerned that their rights might be violated. So what are we doing in this space? We have started out by talking with the city at all different levels to try and change the crisis response from one that involves police to one that involves peers, those with lived mental health experience, and emergency medical technicians, modeling our thinking after a very well-known program in Oregon, the CAHOOTS program, with a 35-plus-year track record. We have advocated in the legislative space. We're very excited that we have just had legislation introduced on the state level called Daniel's Law. I commend that to your attention, and will urge people to ensure that that gets passed in short order. We have been very active in getting the body-worn camera footage of the police who have done the shootings and the killings under the banner "Picture Worth 1,000 Words," to actually see what has happened to individuals shot at the hands of the police, and why police as a whole are not the best by a long shot at de-escalating crises. And you can see that if you want. Those are on our website. We've also put out a report, based on a survey of the community. What kind of crisis response do they want? You can find that on our website. Saving lives, reducing trauma, removing police from New York City's mental health crisis response. We have been active in rallies. We continue to be active in rallies. We are looking to get city legislation out there as well. And finally, I will close by saying on our list is a class action lawsuit known as Baerga versus New York City, where we are trying to get the kind of relief of a transformed mental health crisis system through litigation. And as part of that, we filed for a temporary restraining order when the mayor came out with his pronouncement. Happy to talk more about any of that, but now it's my pleasure, my privilege to introduce our moderator. So, let me
just say hello briefly, if I may.
For goodness sakes, I know what I'm supposed to do, Mark. I'm supposed to introduce you.
No problem. I'm going to turn it right over to our terrific moderator.
Exactly,
Alex.
exactly. So I please would like to introduce, shame on me, Mark Fliedner, whom I've already introduced, would of course also like to talk about the work that's coming out of his office. And please hit it, Mark, with apologies.
No, please, no worries at all. Mark Fliedner, as Ruth said, I'm the director of the programs for folks with significant mental illness and traumatic brain injury at Disability Rights New York, DRNY. I am a man with gray hair and a pretty gray beard and glasses, sitting with a light shirt on in front of a blue backdrop that has some of our DRNY contact information. We can always be reached at drny.org. DRNY is the protection and advocacy system for people with all disabilities in the state of New York. And we are working in this very same space that Ruth described. Always want to hear the stories of folks who were involuntarily removed, particularly by police officers or those who work in the transit system, because we want to hear about how that is actually being accomplished. But I want to turn this over to the conversation that will be initiated by our colleague, Alex Vitale, and thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark. Again, apologies. And one other person I don't want to have go unnamed, that's my colleague, Noel Peñas in my office, who has been the behind the scenes person, and will shout out Katrin as well from Disability Rights New York, who has done an amazing job behind the scenes putting this all together. So thanks to those wonderful women as well. And now to introduce our moderator, Alex Vitale. As I said, he's a professor at Brooklyn College. He's also the coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project. His expertise lies in areas that will be of great interest to us tonight in the policing space, specifically in the community policing space, drug policy, violence, crime, alternatives to incarceration. Very interestingly, he consults with the police on the one hand and human rights groups on the other hand. I will close. There's a lot to be said about him, but I will close by saying, because I'm sure he'll say things about himself, that he has written two very prominent books, City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics. And I will just say as an editorial note, I really hope you do talk a little bit about that, Alex, because I think that says the bells go off, that's about the Giuliani administration. And I think we all think how, whoa, wait a minute, we thought we were rid of that fiasco, but it seems like it's coming back at us. So I'd love to hear about that. And the other amazing book is The End of Policing. And with that, Alex, please take it away and introduce yourself, the panelists, and thanks to all.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Mark, for inviting me to be part of this terribly important conversation that we're having. I'm not going to say anything more about myself, but I have some really impressive bios to read about our three panelists, and I hope to rely on them to help tell this important story that needs to be told this evening. So let me start with my buddy Felix Guzman. We had a chance to talk about some of these issues recently at an event here in Brooklyn. Just so you know, I use he and him pronouns. I'm a white male with kind of brown and gray hair, wearing glasses, a blue sport coat, in my home in Brooklyn with a pretty plain background. So Felix Guzman is a poet, community organizer, and advocate working towards building healthy communities inclusive of all. He organizes with Vocal New York, one of my favorite groups, building positive conversations around issues of ending mass incarceration, homelessness, promoting harm reduction, mental health treatment services, and is a survivor of these broken systems, unfortunately. Felix is an advocate for the community at large, who has experienced mental health challenges because of his lived experience of periods of incarceration, homelessness, and psychiatric hospitalization. Felix is a steering committee member of CCIT NYC, a coalition of members calling for a non-police peer-led response to mental health crises. He's been appointed to the New York City Council Commission on Community Reinvestment and the closure of Rikers Island, the city's largest mental health facility, in essence, and working, to bring justice to those who've been directly impacted by these systems. Dr. Stephen M. Smith is a licensed clinical psychologist whose professional mission is and has been dedicated to advancing health equity for marginalized communities and individuals experiencing mental health concerns. Of particular interest are concerns related to the experience of psychosis. Dr. Smith is trained in the use of various recovery-focused approaches and interventions to psychosis, whether providing direct care or training and supporting other treatment providers. Dr. Smith constantly seeks to expand our understanding of the impact of cultural and structural factors on how we conceptualize and respond to individuals experiencing psychosis. Dr. Smith also has a private practice in which he provides psychotherapy, especially to adult men of color. And Dr. Jeanie C., MD, is the senior medical director at Fountain House, a clubhouse community of people with serious mental illnesses in New York City. She is an associate professor at the NYU School of Medicine. She previously served as the chief medical officer at ICL, a New York City non-for-profit serving people with mental illness and developmental disabilities, where she worked for 15 years. She led ICL and its partners on award-winning integrated health initiatives, including development of the East New York Health Hub in an underserved Brooklyn neighborhood, and an integration of primary care into a community treatment and other behavioral health settings. She is past president of the New York City chapter or the New York chapters of the American Association of Psychiatric Administrators and the American Association of Community Psychiatrists, and an alumnus of the National Council for Behavioral Health Psychiatry Leadership Program. She's the co-editor of A Case-Based Approach to Public Psychiatry, a text that explores the foundational principles of community mental health services and the care needs of special populations. She has a special interest in disrupting the impact of trauma on health outcomes with an overarching aim to bridge the gap between academic psychiatry and the clinical challenges of under-resourced communities, a goal that I can very much relate to as an academic who works closely with community-based organizations, the media, and trying to bridge that gap between academic knowledge and real-world practice. Jeanie, maybe I'll open with you and maybe ask you to say a little bit about how do we get into this mess of having huge numbers of people who are unhoused, experiencing psychiatric challenges, and creating this sense of crisis that has been, turned into a whole set of political discourses and some challenging practices?
Well, I think it starts with looking at our values as a society, right? If we have continually underfunded the care of and live in a place in a country where resources are not accessible equitably, you will inevitably have situations where people do not get the care or the basic resources they need to stay well. And I think that's the basis here. So there is a minority, a very small minority of people who have serious mental illnesses, specifically schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression, which are the diagnoses that make people eligible for our clubhouse community, Fountain House. there's a minority of people with these disorders who have histories of aggression and violence. So it's about 10% of folks with schizophrenia have histories of aggression, and about 3 to 5% have an actual history of violence. And because these sorts of incidents that happen with people with schizophrenia hit the news, because they occur because of impaired judgment and are often kind of bizarre incidents, they hit the news and it becomes something where folks think that everyone with schizophrenia must be violent. But actually, people with schizophrenia are about 14 times more likely to be to be victims of violence than other people in our communities, than people in the general population, for instance. So that this is actually a community of people who have a lot of vulnerability and are rarely the people who are violent. In fact, when people with serious mental illnesses are aggressive or violent, usually it's within the context of family members, which is where a lot of violence across, sectors occurs. It's with people who are loved ones in the context of arguments and so forth. We know that people with serious mental illnesses, when they can access treatment, do much better and are unlikely to commit any acts of violence. But we have set up a society where it's really hard for people to find the treatment they need. And to find treatment you need, you also have to have things that folks have already talked about: stable housing, access to food, access to medication, clothing, childcare. The list goes on. And so places like and the ones represented by the folks on this panel, I think, support people in accessing those things. So Fountain House is an open door for anyone with serious mental illness to join a community, to give and take in the community, and to access all of those social drivers of health, housing, income, food, and so forth. I'll leave it there, but I
will ask you, I'm going to ask you more about Fountain House and the role of these kinds of peer-to-peer, low barrier settings in a minute, but let's get a little bit more of the larger conversation on the table first. I mean, I think it's fair to say, right, that this problem is not some emergency that came out of nowhere, that this is a problem that has been with us literally for decades, that has been driven by a kind of systematic underfunding and defunding of both housing for people in need and baseline mental health services. And this is an outgrowth out of decisions at the national level, the state level, and the local level about dismantling really problematic state mental health hospitals, and then failing to provide the support services that would allow people to live independently with dignity with adequate resources. And so now, when there's a periodic event or set of occurrences, it's framed as an emergency that requires an immediate and often very punitive response. So Felix, I want to ask you about how you see the way the media has been portraying folks who experience these crises, especially those who are living in the shelter system, living in the subway system, living outdoors, and what this tells us about the politics around this issue.
I think that there is definitely a campaign of fear mongering that has been occurring throughout the years, and when we talk about mental health in the context of those of our unhoused neighbors and so forth, and those incarcerated, we have to realize that they have been failed severely by the systems in place, and that there is a need for intervention, and not just intervention, but wraparound intervention as well, as as it was spoken previously about the underfunding and the cuts and whatnot, there is definitely a need for a reality check, where there is a commitment from the city and to put the practice into place and procedures into place so that people don't fall through the cracks. Again, when people are left without resources and also appropriate intervention, then it is expected that there's going to be some upset and some kind of unhealthy response to trauma. So if we can address the trauma and kind of prevent it, then there is a possibility that we can go ahead and eliminate the stigma that people with mental illness are violent. I think that because the media kind of latches onto these stories of persons with mental illness being disheveled or behaving aggressively and so forth, but they don't highlight the stories of those with mental illness who are professors, who are doctors, who are elected officials, and they don't highlight those stories. They like to highlight what sells press, and what sells press is controversy, and what creates fear mongering. So when we look at how to turn these stories of people impacted by mental health in these demographics, we can easily turn these into success stories by creating pathways out of trauma, addressing trauma with wraparound services, exposure to healthy community, and putting peer resources around them, so then that way they can actually have access to services and treatment that is, one, adherent to informed consent, that respects right to fail if that so is the desire, to be directive in the care. Furthermore than that, but we have to be mindful that people should be given the resources to be able to succeed. And currently what we're doing is not allowing people who are at their most vulnerable to do so. So yeah, resources, services, and money's invested.
Thanks, Felix. Steve, how do you think, from the folks that you work with clinically, what is the impact of these stereotyped and punitive discourses on their sense of security, their sense of their place in society? And in particular, what role do you think race has played in all of this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there's a lot of research that points to this idea that people with mental health concerns, they don't just shed those concerns, they actually start to internalize some of the stigma that is surrounding their condition. So the things they hear, the stereotypes they hear from the public, from their friends, from their family, from the news, they actually start to believe that. They start to believe that about themselves, and believe that they can't contribute to society, or believe that they or have a propensity for violence. And that in turn creates more dependence and more passivity, dependence on the system, but more passivity in terms of the feeling that recovery is possible. So these negative views of the public absolutely can cause more damage than the symptom itself, because it really attacks the psyche and the sense of recovery for individuals experiencing these mental health concerns. And to address the latter question, the question about race, it's a big question. I wanted to jump back to something Dr. C said, the value system of our society. And when we think of why there's this connection between mental health and dangerousness is so durable, so long-standing, it really, as a psychologist, for me, it comes down to basic response to anxiety, right? We see these images on TV, we feel anxious. And when we're anxious, we go back, we tend to be more conservative and go back and lean more on our value systems. The unfortunate thing is our society, our value systems of society are based on issues of racism, issues of patriarchy, Eurocentric views that says that the individual is responsible for their problems, racism that pathologizes people that don't look like us, patriarchy that puts people in power that to make decisions about communities that they don't understand. So when we see these images on TV, it creates a lot of anxiety. And when people get anxious, they lean back on the things that they feel most comfortable with, these value systems. And I think the way that I think the nature of this connection between dangerousness and mental illness is really because it justifies that we don't have to take a look at ourselves. It kind of tells us that, we're not going to look at all the other things we can do. This is the means to an end right here. And what we see particularly is what's most detrimental is marginalized communities, right? Marginalized communities are often the ones that are overdiagnosed with the severe mental illness. They are often the ones that are sent directly to the hospital rather than engaged in community settings. When they are in the hospital, physicians actually spend less time with them. So on all aspects, the care that they get is just really, really skewed in a way that maintains some of what they're experiencing, right? So not only do we collectively experience anxiety, not only do we fall back on these value systems that are inherent in our culture, but then we enact mechanisms and biases and practices that actually maintain the mental illness, right? And to maintain the mental illness in the people that are frequenting our hospitals and community organizations. So it's a confluence of things. I used to think that race was kind of the biggest factor, but there's so many isms that are working to maintain themselves that can contribute to this. And I think oftentimes it's the marginalized communities, the ones without much of a voice, the ones that are often pathologized, that are kind of the victims of this kind of systemic control.
In that way, there's a kind of indirect racism at work here, right? Because why are certain communities of color always in a more vulnerable position to these kinds of stigmatizing policies? Yeah. Felix, Stephen also mentioned this way in which the demonization of people is a way of forestalling other kinds of conversations about these problems. So I wonder if you want to say something about how you understand the politics of this issue and how these misrepresentations serve some people's political interests. It's not just that they are uninformed about these realities of people's lived experiences, but they are mobilizing these views for political purposes.
I think it's easy to say lock someone up. I think it's easy to say that people can't be redeemed and that society can attribute throwing people away indefinitely. I think when you look at it from that framework and understand that controversy sells and controversy creates votes and controversy without any kind of reason or logic or compassion assures that there is failure for a demographic that is not appropriately represented nor encouraged or included in these kind of conversations. So as someone who is formerly incarcerated and also formerly homeless, I understand how society attributes to those two demographics that redemption is not possible, or that that there is no kind of bouncing back from these kind of blemishes. And I think that when there is a need for a scapegoat for a public conversation on policy failure and lack of intervention, it's easy to say people are in need of being hospitalized against their will, when the conversation should really be about resources, intervention, housing, education, employment, treatment that is effective, low barrier access to treatment, and also having access to culturally competent trauma-informed practitioners who provide informed consent and so forth. I think that there is stigma all over the on all sides of the conversation on mental health, and that when society doesn't want to look at how it actually manufactures the homelessness problem in the crisis, it's easy to say people are ungrateful or not doing what they can to be productive citizens. But when you have a demographic of people who are continuously not given resources to achieve a healthy baseline, let alone excel, it's easy to say that people can't achieve wellness or moral success without having a forced intervention. So again, these are kind of conversations that have to be realistic, but also have a compassionate framework to understand that, I myself am someone who has had forced hospitalizations, who has been, at other times also provided life-saving intervention by the NYPD. So I understand what it means to also be realistic in terms of scope of access and also intervention. So with that framework being said right there, I think that what really should be the conversation is definitely what is a holistic intervention and how can we get this happening for everyone so that they can access wellness, productive citizenry, and also just access to achieving their potential. So again, resources, services, culturally competent, accessible treatment providers, and also just even going as far as to allow for UBI, universal basic income grants, to allow people to achieve a measure of being above the poverty level so that they can actually access better quality care as well. So there's so much that can be said, but again, as someone who is a part of so many marginalized demographics, I understand what it means to pull yourself up from, unfortunately it's kind of cliche, but from the proverbial bootstraps. But I shouldn't have to, because again, if I'm struggling, then where are my resources? How can I be a productive citizen if I'm not provided interventions to achieve any kind of potential other than the bare minimum or being under the threshold of poverty? So we have to be mindful that everyone is deserving of an opportunity to have access to wellness, to actually have access to dignity being magnified, not just preserved or maintained, but magnified. And also just we should be.
Let me ask Jeanie a couple of follow-ups on that, okay? Because these are really important points. And maybe, Jeanie, if I could ask you to talk a little bit about best practices, and especially the role of these kinds of frontline services, voluntary frontline services that include peer-to-peer components, because so often we think of emergency rooms as like the full scope of what's needed, when in fact that might be the least not the least desirable, but the end of a system of filtering, for only those cases it can't be managed through earlier interventions.
Yeah, thank you. I think I forgot to say what I look like for some of our participants. I've got black shoulder length hair, and I'm in a orange plaid dress, and I'm Chinese American. So I think what I want to say, as I've been listening, is how important it is to understand that if people with serious mental illness commit acts of violence, it is at a rate very comparable to the general population if substance abuse is not involved. And this is the most treatable, situation where violence occurs. People who are career criminals, people who are misogynists, those things we know as treatment providers are very hard to treat in any setting. But when someone has a serious mental illness, and that is the reason their judgment might be impaired or they may be paranoid, that is something that we know best practices for. And we know it starts, just like others have been saying, with social drivers of health, just having basic needs met so that that is not a source of anxiety like Stephen talked about. But beyond that, I mean, their medication is very effective for many of these illnesses. And while lack of insight into the need for treatment prevents some people from getting care, what we've learned at Fountain House is that when you present care in starting with the things that people actually want, and need, like housing and food and so forth, and relationships and warmth and caring, and that things that are harder to find in an emergency room and easier to find in our big clubhouse on 47th Street, or in our kiosk in Times Square, where we serve free coffee for anybody who wants to walk up. When you present care in that context, people want it, and people want to, I'm a popular person. Usually doctors are people that are someone that people with serious mental illness generally don't want to have a relationship with. But here, they know I'm part of their community. And so they want to talk to me. They want to bring their questions to me. And when people become ill and become sometimes a risk to themselves or to other people, they will seek out the community for help. And if everyone could be encapsulated in a community like this, I do not think that we would be even thinking that mental illness equals violence, because we would see, like we see in Fountain House, people working. The paintings behind me are by Barry Senft, who is a member. We have a functioning, very successful gallery. We have a shop in Soho that sells sustainable bath and home goods that people can access. Because when people have work, friends, and purpose, when they feel the need to be, when we nurture the need to be needed, and people feel like they have a place of belonging, not just that they have the things they need, but that they're needed to provide for other people. We have a stable situation where treatment is only just, one ingredient. And so that's the best practice that I'm promoting today. I also work on an assertive community treatment team, a multidisciplinary mobile team, where we go out to people in the streets and in the homes and shelters and wherever they want to meet us, or are sitting like on a park bench, and provide that care. And so we need a continuum of services knit together that functions in concert to make sure that people don't fall through the gaps.
And of course, all of this is aggravated by a lack of stable housing.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if you wanted me to.
I just following up on that, right? So that, part of being able to be part of a community requires some level of basic stability in your everyday life. When people are living in shelters or on the streets and constantly having to deal with the everyday challenges that poses, it makes it very difficult to participate in a stable community.
Absolutely. And so New York State is much better than most at investing in supported housing for people with mental illness, but there's still dire need. The homelessness numbers in New York City, nobody has to tell anybody how staggering they are. And, children growing up without housing. I'm a child psychiatrist by training, actually. And what's been of interest to me is how the risk for mental illnesses builds from day one, from prenatal care through to early childhood experiences, and to the lack of nurture that some kids experience from day one, and access to treatment from day one. But we do have to address childhood homelessness as part of this prevention effort.
Thank you. Steve, let me ask you about what the experience, or I guess, we've seen the situation of an enhanced role yet again for the police in being a front line of interaction with folks who are especially unhoused, but even some who are housed but are having a mental health crisis. What are the risks associated with having such a police-centered approach to this problem?
I mean, biggest risk is death, right? You're approaching mental health concerns with people that are armed, armed and can have the capacity to cause harm or kill. But you're also empowering people who often carry the same stereotypes about dangerousness. So the assumption is already built in that people with mental health concerns are dangerous. And when you give someone that carries that assumption a gun or the means to do that, it creates really dangerous situations. I think I've always thought of, what happens to police officers in those moments. Again, I go back to, we're not investing enough in understanding why a police officer decides to shoot, other than that they can feel very scared, very anxious, or they whatever, something is being triggered. But I think we need to invest more time in addition to engaging the community and having the police play a more of a less of a central role here. I think we have to understand what's going on for police officers to show up to a situation and automatically assume that violence, I'm going to meet violence with violence, like that's the answer. And in my kind of research that I've seen, oftentimes it's the police officers that have experienced a ton of trauma themselves, or over masculinized views of themselves in society, need to exert power, or individuals that feel incredibly anxious, and what they do with that anxiety is to exert control. So it really creates situations where people that are not trained to deal with mental health crises, but also haven't done the work themselves and are carrying around some real sensitivities and wounds that are put in the position to respond to people that need the most amount of sympathy and empathy and care. So for me, I would really just be curious of, we're empowering people who often don't carry around the same compassion towards those that are in need of the compassion. That's the medicine, is the compassion. Similar to what Dr. C talked about, it's, if we could respond with, instead of control, violence, even medications, right? If that wasn't our first line of defense, but these recovery aspects of connection, of purpose, of helping people feel that they're not alone in this. I mean, that could be an incredible for frontline response. And I think, unfortunately, our police officers, police departments aren't trained. I don't think they invest in the training to do those things. I think it's, again, this idea of our value system kicks in, where the best way to deal with these responses is to exert dominance, is to house people away and push them to the margins, or push them to asylums or hospitals. We know that doesn't solve the problem. So I'm very, very kind of curious about what happens in that moment, and how do we start to work through some of the stuff and prevent some of the things that a lot of police officers are carrying around and bringing to these very intense, delicate moments.
Yeah, and of course, we say, well, police officers aren't adequately trained, but even in places where they have received extra training, including many officers in New York, we don't see significant improvements in outcomes. And I think part of it is just structural, right? You're sending someone who spends most of their time in the business of command, control, and threat neutralization. And no amount of training is going to turn them into a clinical mental health worker whose primary orientation is, someone's well-being in a moment of crisis, because that's just not that job. And I think also, the presence of an armed police officer is often triggering and destabilizing for the person they're approaching. So that actually adds to the likelihood of an escalation of conflict, sometimes in part because police are associated with things like forced hospitalization and prior use of violence. And so people have some reason to be resistant, skeptical, distrustful, et cetera, in these situations. Yeah. Well, any quick closing thoughts from any of our panelists about this topic before I turn it back to Mark for some closing remarks? We covered a lot of territory in the short time we've had together today. So let me turn it back to Mark, who can talk about some of the work that's happening and possible next steps.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this extraordinary conversation. It's a conversation that sadly, as Steve, you said to me when I first reached out to you about this, sadly is still continuing and has to continue. And I think that one of the most important things about a gathering like this is that we are all connected, and that includes those that have joined us. Please take note. Google's a wonderful thing. Please take note of names. Please take note of our organizations and how to reach us. Great. Thank you, Jeanie, for putting that out. Catherine just put into the chat a link to a report that DRNY did with John Jay College of Criminal Justice after Daniel Prude was killed in Rochester, to come up with guiding principles for communities that are looking to for alternatives to response for those who are in mental health crisis. And I do have to say, from DRNY's perspective, and some of that is influenced by what I've learned from Alex Vitale over the years, frankly, from reading his extraordinary work and my own professional experiences, is that not only are police not, the ideal people to be responding to these things, but they're absolutely the wrong people. In a time when we're struggling to get more people to sign up for the job, why are we not shifting the budget to get people, including peers and including peer advocates, to be the people that approach those who are in crisis? It seems to me to be just common sense. And I think that everything that you all have said is clear. The most important thing that I leave here with is a better understanding of why the stigma around violence and how I would be perceived as a person with mental health issues is not the way to go, and it's so short-sighted. Please continue the conversation, including if it's not in agreement with what I'm saying. That's what's the beauty of these kinds of forums. And I very much want to thank all of the panelists and all of those who, and certainly our terrific moderator, and all of those who tuned in on a Thursday evening to try and educate themselves about these issues. We can be reached at drny.org. And again, Ruth, since you are still here, it's 5:57. If you want to give a way for people to reach out to you, why don't you go ahead and do that again?
Thank you so much. You can reach me at rlowen, first initial last name, at nyli.org. And I guess just maybe repeating that particular, if anybody who's listening has concerns about individuals who have experienced any kind of implementation of the mayor's new policy with respect to sweeps, that would be important to me too. I'd be grateful for that. And you can take a look at our website and the CCIT NYC website for information on proposals, take a look at Daniel, and I think that does it for me. Thank you, Mark, for offering that. Thank you very, very much to the panelists. Very, very informative, rich discussion.
Have a safe evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us.